The last light of autumn sank behind the Pacific peaks, painting the sky in streaks of molten copper. Margaret Whitlow moved through the redwood grove with the quiet patience of someone long accustomed to solitude. 65 years had thinned her frame but sharpened her senses. She stepped lightly across the carpet of needles, wicker basket balanced on her hip. The forest scent of damp earth and cedar filled her lungs, richer than any perfume she had once known in a different life, a life of Sunday bells and children's laughter that now belonged to another century. The path she followed veered deeper than she had ever dared. She told herself it was for the berries, ripening late in the season, but the truth was a restlessness she could not name. Years of widowhood had settled over her like moss, and tonight it felt suddenly heavy. She pressed on, boots sinking into the soft loam, until the faint rush of water called her toward a hidden creek. A low sound halted her, a resonant hum, neither wind nor bird, vibrating through the trunks. Margaret froze, every sense awake. The twilight thickened around her as she crept toward the sound, pushing aside a veil of fern. The creek flashed silver beneath the dying sun, and there, kneeling in the current, was a creature she could not comprehend. At first she thought it a mun, broad-shouldered and bent over the water. Then the figure shifted, and moonlight touched a pelt of dark gray, muscles like sculpted stone beneath the sheen of wet fur. A silverback gorilla, massive and utterly real, rinsed a deep scratch on its forearm, water swirling crimson around its hand. Impossible. No circus had come through these mountains in decades. No tales of escaped beasts. Yet he was there, breathing in slow, deliberate rhythm. Margaret's heart thudded. Instinct urged her to turn and vanish, to let the wilderness reclaim its secret. But the creature lifted his head, and their eyes met across the creek. His gaze held her, not the wild glare of a predator but something older, steadier, a quiet intelligence that seemed to reach through the years of her loneliness. The forest itself seemed to pause. Even the wind stilled. They stayed like that, two statues carved by the fading light. Margaret felt the ache of her own breath, the weight of her basket. She could not say how long the moment lasted before the gorilla lowered his head and resumed washing the wound, as if granting her presence. The spell broke. She stepped back, careful not to snap a twig, and then she fled through the redwoods, her pulse roaring in her ears. That night's sleep would not come. The small cabin, usually a refuge, felt like a cage. She sat by the hearth long after the fire died, replaying the image of those deep brown eyes. There had been no threat in them, only a recognition she could not explain. When dawn edged the horizon, she decided she would go back. The next evening she carried a bundle of apples in her shawl, hands trembling not from fear but from something like anticipation. The forest welcomed her with its damp breath and distant calls. She followed the same trail, heart racing with every step, until the creek opened before her. Mist drifted off the water in ghostly ribbons. He was there. The silverback stood half-shadowed among the ferns, immense and motionless. Margaret stopped well short of the bank and lowered herself to the ground, setting the apples between them on the moss. The air pulsed with quiet tension. He regarded her with that same unreadable calm, head tilted slightly, chest rising and falling like a slow tide. She spoke without meaning to. "I won't harm you." Her voice sounded foreign after days of silence. The gorilla blinked, a single slow gesture, and remained still. Minutes stretched. A jay screeched high above, the only sound daring to intrude. Margaret took an apple from the bundle and rolled it gently across the moss. It bumped to a stop a few feet from him. He lowered his gaze, then his great hand moved, cautious, deliberate. Fingers thick as branches closed around the fruit. He lifted it, sniffed, and for a breath Margaret thought he might toss it aside. Instead he turned the apple once in his palm, then with a small, almost playful motion, nudged it back toward her. Her breath caught. The apple rolled across the moss and came to rest beside her boot. Something inside her shifted, subtle as the changing tide. Here in the vast silence of the redwoods, two solitary creatures had acknowledged each other. No words, no promises, only a simple act of trust that felt larger than any she had known in years. The forest seemed to exhale, and for the first time since grief had claimed her life, Margaret felt a faint, undeniable pulse of wonder. Days unfolded into a rhythm the forest seemed to bless. Each morning Margaret rose before the mist burned away, her breath clouding in the cold air, and found him waiting near the creek as though he had always been part of her life. They moved together without planning, bending to gather berries, waiting for fish in the shallows, tracing the quiet paths between cedar and pine. No words passed between them, only the soft cadence of leaves underfoot and the low murmur of water that became their shared language. Sometimes she spoke aloud, testing a voice gone and used for years, and the sound startled her, rough as bark yet warming in her chest. The gorilla would pause, tilting his great head as if listening, and she felt the woods themselves teaching her to speak again. Winter swept down from the mountains with sudden ferocity. Snow fell in heavy, silencing drifts, erasing trails and swallowing the horizon. One evening a wind like 1,000 ghostly whistles tore through the redwoods, driving needles sideways. Margaret fought her way toward the creek, shawl pulled tight, but the storm blinded her until a shadow loomed through the swirling white. He emerged like a living boulder, chest flecked with snow, eyes calm. Without hesitation he led her to a hidden cave beneath a jut of stone. The darkness inside pulsed with his warmth and the earthy scent of damp moss. She huddled against his massive flank as the gale screamed outside, feeling his breath rise and fall like a tide. Hours passed in that shelter, and for the first time in decades she slept unafraid, the wild world raging beyond while a silent guardian kept her safe. When the thaw came, danger took a human form. 3 trappers rode through the valley, their voices carrying on the crisp air. Margaret caught fragments: monster, bounty, hide worth a fortune. Panic sharpened her senses. She knew the signs they followed, the faint impressions of giant knuckles in the soil, and she could not allow them to find him. Moving quickly, she brushed away tracks and laid false ones leading toward the eastern ridge. The men cursed and veered after the decoy trail, their rifles glinting in the pale sun. Only when their echoes faded did she allow herself to breathe. But ice lay hidden beneath the melting snow, and as she turned back a slick patch betrayed her. She slipped, striking the ground hard enough to steal her breath. Pain flared hot and blinding. Through the haze she sensed a shadow, then strong arms, gentle despite their power, lifting her as if she weighed no more than a child. He carried her to the cave, his eyes dark with concern, and stayed beside her until the trembling eased. Their lives intertwined beyond simple companionship. She learned the meaning of his low rumbles, the subtle shift of shoulders that signaled caution or calm. He seemed to understand her moods before she spoke them, drawing close when loneliness crept in, standing sentinel when she wandered too far. Each day they shared a quiet communion that defied the world's vocabulary. Margaret felt the years of grief and human expectation fall away like old bark. This was no fantasy of youth, no echo of church bells and bridal lace. It was something wilder, older, a recognition between 2 beings who had outlasted the rules of their kind. Sometimes, when the moon spilled silver across the treetops, she would rest her weathered hand on his broad back and feel the slow, steady heartbeat beneath. In that rhythm she heard not only survival but a promise beyond words. She realized that love need not be named to be real, it could exist in shared silence, in the trust of a gaze, in the simple act of breathing the same cold mountain air. Spring returned in a rush of color. The valley burst with wildflowers, and streams ran clear with snow melt. At dawn one morning he guided her to a ridge she had never climbed. The climb was steep, her legs aching, but he waited at every turn, a quiet strength at her side. When they reached the summit the sun spilled over the world like molten gold. Below them the forest stretched to the edge of sight, alive with birdsong and the scent of new growth. Margaret placed her hand on his great arm, the coarse for warm beneath her palm. He leaned lightly against her shoulder, a gesture so gentle it brought tears she hadn't shed in decades. She looked out over the endless green and felt the years slip from her heart. At 65 she had believed love was a door forever closed. Yet here, where no preacher's words or society's rules could reach, the wilderness had kept a secret for her, one that would live as long as the mountains themselves.